March 17, 1943, Berlin. A folder slammed down onto a mahogany desk so hard that coffee splashed onto top-secret reports that could have cost men their lives if the Gestapo had ever seen them. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of German military intelligence, stared at the papers in disbelief. His hand trembled. What he was reading wasn't just impossible, it was a nightmare. The Ford Motor Company, deep inside America, had supposedly built an assembly line capable of producing a 1.5 million part bomber every 63 minutes, a B-24 Liberator rolling off the line like a car. To the Nazis, this wasn't just unthinkable, it was heresy against their entire world view. Through the tall windows of the Abwehr headquarters, Canaris could see the Landwehr Canal, a place already stained by political executions and failed revolutions. He knew in that moment, staring at the documents, that if these numbers were true, Germany's fate was already sealed. Not because of battlefield heroics, not because of brilliant generals, but because of something far more terrifying to a regime that prided itself on strength through blood: mathematics. Industrial mathematics. Production at a scale the Reich could not even begin to imagine. Yet here was the paradox. German intelligence officers had done their jobs. Their agents across Mexico City, Spain, Sweden, even neutral Switzerland, all whispered the same impossible claim. America's Willow Run plant was building bombers faster than Germany could produce its own vehicles. The numbers came from too many sources to be ignored. And yet, Canaris knew what would happen when he carried these papers to Hermann Göring or to Hitler himself. He knew they would laugh. They would sneer at the very idea that a democracy, a country filled with women in factories, immigrants on assembly lines, and workers of every race, could outproduce the master race. They would dismiss it all as propaganda. But Canaris couldn't laugh, he couldn't dismiss it, because in his bones he knew the truth. If Ford could really build bombers like sausages on a line. The war wasn't a contest of will anymore, it was a countdown, a matter of time. And that knowledge, that unbearable truth, was the beginning of one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. The first whisper came not from Washington or London, but from a hotel lobby in neutral Lisbon. A German intelligence officer, disguised as a shipping clerk, had intercepted a casual remark from an American businessman bragging about a factory bigger than a city. The man claimed it wasn't just a plant, it was an empire of steel, glass and concrete, stretching nearly a mile long. At first, Berlin dismissed it. Surely no single building could roll out aircraft like bread loaves. But the Abwehr began collecting scraps, shipping invoices, unusual cargo manifests, reports of aluminum shortages in Michigan. The puzzle pieces, scattered across continents, began to form a terrifying shape. By late 1942, the picture was undeniable. The Willow Run plant near Detroit wasn't a rumor. It was a juggernaut. The brainchild of Henry Ford and Charles Sorensen, Willow Run was designed to mass-produce war machines the same way Ford had once mass-produced Model Ts. Inside its walls, 42,000 workers, many of them women in coveralls, their hands blackened with grease, assembled the B-24 Liberator. To the Germans, the idea of women riveting wings onto bombers was laughable. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. The numbers were obscene. A factory that once turned out cars was now capable of building an entire bomber every hour. And not just any bomber, the B-24, a monster with a 110-foot wingspan, 10 machine guns, and a 2,800-mile range. These weren't toys. These were flying fortresses designed to reduce cities to ashes. German agents filed frantic reports. The plant consumed more aluminum each month than the entire Luftwaffe's aircraft industry. Its supply trains stretched for miles. Its runways were alive with squadrons of fresh bombers lifting into the sky like clockwork. And yet, inside the Reich Chancellery, when these reports landed on Hitler's desk, he waved them away with disgust. "Amerik and bluster," he sneered. Göring, bloated and delusional, laughed aloud. "Let them build," he said. "They are amateurs. We are warriors." But the men in German intelligence knew. The clerks crunching the numbers knew. Canaris knew. Even the secretaries typing up the reports knew. This wasn't bluster. This was a machine of war that didn't bleed, didn't sleep, and didn't care how many German aces filled the skies. Because for every Messerschmitt shot down, Willow Run could build another bomber. And another. And another. And that was the horror. Germany wasn't losing to soldiers. It was losing to math. It began as a rumour in the intelligence offices, but by 1943, German pilots no longer needed reports. They could look up. The first missions over occupied Europe had been routine, small formations of American bombers lumbering through flak and fighter screens, vulnerable, outnumbered, predictable. But then something changed. From airfields in England, entire waves of silver B-24 Liberators began to rise like an armada of steel birds. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Squadrons so vast they seemed to blot out the sun. Luftwaffe veterans who had once prided themselves on dueling lone Spitfires and Hurricanes now stared in disbelief as formation after formation of bombers stretched across the horizon. Willow Run's assembly lines were no longer whispers in reports. They were thundering engines over the skies of Bremen, Hamburg, and the Ruhr. Hans-Joachim Marseille, one of Germany's famed fighter aces, once scoffed that American pilots were flying bus drivers. But the joke evaporated the moment pilots saw that for every bomber they shot down, 5 more seemed to appear the next week. German squadrons scrambled daily, draining fuel, pilots, and ammunition, resources that the Reich could not replace. Each engagement felt like punching into an endless tide. And it wasn't just the numbers, it was the design. The B-24 could fly farther and carry more bombs than the RAF's beloved Lancaster. With its long, slender wings, it looked ungainly, almost fragile. But appearances deceived. These machines were engineered for war at scale, cheaper to build, faster to assemble, easier to replace. For the Allies, a bomber lost was a tragedy. For Willow Run, it was simply a line item, already replaced by another rolling off the conveyor. Pilots reported it with horror. "We shoot them down," one Luftwaffe squadron leader admitted, and yet the next morning the sky is full again. It was PS ecological warfare before a single bomb even fell. A realization that the Reich wasn't fighting another nation, it was fighting an industrial engine too vast to comprehend. In Berlin, the High Command still called it propaganda. But on the front lines, the truth screamed through every dogfight, every mission, every burning German city. Willow Run was real. Its bombers were real. And with each passing week, Germany's skies grew darker, not from clouds, but from the shadows of America's assembly lines turned airborne apocalypse. While German generals mocked the idea of women building war machines, halfway across the Atlantic, inside the roaring belly of Willow Run, history was being rewritten by hands they would never recognize. The factory floor stretched farther than the eye could see. 3.5 million square feet of concrete and steel. The air thundered with rivet guns, conveyor belts, and the unbroken rhythm of a machine that never slept. At its heart stood women in bandanas and coveralls, their hair tucked under scarves, sweat dripping into their eyes as they hammered, welded, and bolted together the wings of death. They were housewives turned machinists, mothers turned mechanics. For many, it was the first paying job of their lives. To the Reich, they didn't matter. To history, they were unstoppable. African-American workers, often shunned in peacetime factories, now laboured shoulder to shoulder with immigrants, southerners, and farm boys who had traded fields for fuselages. The war had forced open doors that prejudice had long kept shut. On the line, nobody cared where you came from. The only thing that mattered was speed, precision, output. 1 bomber an hour, every hour. And above it all, the shadow of Henry Ford's empire loomed. Ford himself despised the war. a man notorious for his anti-Semitic tirades and uneasy flirtations with fascism. Yet his plant became the arsenal of democracy, his assembly lines churning out the very machines that would one day set Europe ablaze. It was an irony so sharp it cut like steel. The workers knew the stakes. They read the headlines of U-boats prowling the Atlantic, of Nazi troops pushing through Russia, of cities reduced to rubble. Every rivet they drove into the skin of a B-24 felt like a bullet fired back at tyranny. "We're not just building planes," one woman told a reporter. "We're building coffins for Hitler." From the outside, Willow Run was just a building. But inside, it was a battlefield. Not of blood, but of sweat. Not of bullets, but of bolts. And every time the ground shook as another bomber's engines roared to life, every worker on that floor felt the same truth. They were soldiers too. Soldiers with wrenches instead of rifles, but soldiers all the same. And as the German High Command laughed, Willow Run kept laughing louder, with every B-24 that thundered into the sky. By the summer of 1943, German cities began to feel the echo of Willow Run's heartbeat. It came not in whispers, not in reports, but in the thunder of engines over rooftops. Hamburg was the first to learn what it meant. Night after night, waves of bombers swept across the skies, Lancasters and Halifaxes by darkness, B-24 Liberators by daylight. The raids did not stop. They did not pause. They came like tides, each one heavier than the last. At first, the Luftwaffe tried to stand its ground. Fighter squadrons scrambled, flak towers lit up the night, and anti-aircraft fire stitched the heavens with fire. But the mathematics that Canaris had once dreaded now unfolded in real time. For every German fighter that fell, there were no replacements. For every bomber shot down, Willow Run replaced it in hours. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler raged. "Lies! Exaggerations! No nation can build so many machines," he shouted, pounding his fists against the map tables. Göring, once boasting that enemy bombs would never touch German soil, now hid behind curtains as Berlin shook under Allied firestorms. Still, the regime insisted on disbelief, clinging to the myth of German superiority even as its cities turned to ash. But the truth was impossible to ignore. On the ground, civilians watched skies darken with endless fleets of bombers, formations so vast they stretched horizon to horizon. The drone of engines became the soundtrack of life under the Reich. Children covered their ears, mothers prayed, soldiers cursed. Even the most loyal party members whispered the question no one dared say aloud. How many more of these can they possibly have? In Luftwaffe command rooms, the answer chilled them. Reports indicated thousands, and still more coming. Willow Run wasn't just a factory, it was a weapon of psychological annihilation. German pilots, once celebrated as knights of the air, were now worn down by exhaustion, forced to hurl themselves against an enemy that could never be depleted. The nightmare Canaris had foreseen in 1943 was now reality in 1944. Germany was being bombed not into submission, but into inevitability. The skies above the Reich were no longer German skies. They belonged to Willow Run. July 24, 1943, midnight. The sirens in Hamburg wailed, but this was no ordinary raid. Civilians clutched their children, soldiers scrambled into flak positions, and fire brigades prepared for the worst. Yet nothing could prepare the city for what was coming. From the darkness above, the first wave of RAF bombers dropped not just explosives but fire. Incendiaries rained across rooftops, igniting block after block. The sky turned red as entire districts went up in flames. But the nightmare wasn't over. As dawn broke, the drone of engines returned, this time the deep, throbbing sound of B-24 Liberators flying in formation. Willow Run had arrived. The Liberators came in waves, daylight bombers striking with a precision and relentlessness the Luftwaffe could barely comprehend. German fighters tried to intercept, clawing into the sky, but the formations were too vast, too disciplined, too endless. For every bomber that spiraled into smoke, more filled the gaps. On the ground, the firestorm erupted. Winds whipped through burning streets at hurricane speeds, feeding the inferno until oxygen itself seemed to vanish. Entire neighborhoods suffocated as flames consumed everything: houses, factories, families. Temperatures soared to over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt bubbled. Bodies turned to ash where they stood. 40,000 civilians perished in a single week. To the German command, it was a catastrophe beyond imagination. Hamburg wasn't just a city, it was a symbol of industrial power, a hub of shipbuilding and armaments. Now it lay in ruins, its skyline erased by Allied fire and Willow Run's bombers. And still, even as the survivors clawed through rubble, the Reich's leaders dismissed the reports. A temporary setback, they told themselves. The Americans cannot sustain such losses. But intelligence officers knew better. Every bomber lost was already replaced. Willow Run had ensured it. For the people of Hamburg, the terror was personal. For German High Command, it was strategic. But for history, Operation Gomorrah proved something more chilling. America's assembly lines could turn war into an industrial process. Mass death was no longer just a consequence of war. It was a product, stamped out by machines, shipped overseas, and delivered with mathematical precision. In the smouldering ruins of Hamburg, the Reich finally glimpsed the shadow it had tried so hard to deny, the shadow of Willow Run. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the terror it had once been. Its golden age of lightning victories over Poland, France, and the early skies of Russia had faded into memory. Now its pilots were exhausted, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that seemed endless. The culprit was not just British tenacity or Soviet resilience, it was Willow Run. Every morning, from airfields across England, squadrons of B-24 Liberators lifted off like clockwork, escorted by swarms of long-range P-51 Mustangs. For the Luftwaffe, it was like fighting a machine that never tired. Young German recruits, barely trained, were hurled into cockpits to face formations that stretched horizon to horizon. The veterans tried to steady them, but even the most decorated aces knew the truth. There were too many. No matter how many they shot down, replacements filled the skies within weeks. The statistics told the story mercilessly. Between 1943 and 1944, American factories, driven by Willow Run, produced more bombers in a single year than Germany could hope to build in the entire war. Morale crumbled. Fighter pilots, once hailed as Knights of the Reich, now spoke in hushed tones about missions that felt suicidal. "You climb, you fire, you die," one Luftwaffe officer admitted. The endless roar of engines above German soil became a sound not of defiance, but of inevitability. Fuel shortages only deepened the despair. By late 1944, many Luftwaffe planes sat idle, grounded not by enemy fire but by empty tanks. Meanwhile, the Allies flew day and night, bombers and escorts blanketing the skies. For every gallon of fuel Germany lacked, America poured thousands into its war machine. For every German pilot lost, Willow Run sent another fleet to finish the job. Even propaganda began to falter. Goebbels' broadcasts insisted victory was certain, but the men in the cockpits knew better. They had seen the swarms. They had felt the helplessness of diving into a wall of liberators only to watch their comrades fall in flames. Some pilots confessed privately that they no longer fought to win, they fought simply to survive the day. And survival was slipping away. The Luftwaffe's collapse was not just a defeat of planes, but of spirit. It was the slow death of a force that once ruled the skies, smothered by the sheer weight of Willow Run's endless wings. While German skies filled with the thunder of bombers, back in Michigan, the pulse of America's war machine beat inside Willow Run. It was more than a factory, it was a city under a roof. Entire communities were uprooted and replanted in its shadow. Tens of thousands of workers flooded in from across the nation, turning sleepy farmlands into one of the busiest industrial zones in history. Housing shortages became so severe that trailers, hastily built barracks, and entire prefab towns sprang up around the plant. Families crowded into tiny spaces, husbands off at war while wives and daughters worked the line. Cafeterias served thousands of meals a day. Buses ran around the clock to shuttle workers in and out. At its peak, Willow Run's population rivaled that of small American cities. Inside, the rhythm never stopped. Conveyor belts rattled, welding sparks flew, and the smell of oil and steel clung to the air. Supervisors barked orders over the clamour, but the workers already knew the stakes. They weren't just building planes, they were building victory. Every rivet was a rebuttal to tyranny, every finished bomber a promise to sons and husbands fighting overseas. The press called it the arsenal of democracy. But to those who worked there, it was both pride and pressure. The quotas were brutal, the hours were long, mistakes weren't tolerated. And yet there was something electric about it. Housewives who had never touched a tool learned to handle rivet guns. Farmers' sons who once repaired tractors now installed engines into war machines. Immigrants, African Americans, men, women, side by side, they built the planes that would decide the fate of the world. Even celebrities took notice. Journalists toured the factory, snapping photos of women standing proudly beside the bombers they helped assemble. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, her rolled-up sleeves and flexed arm symbolizing a generation that turned industry into resistance. From the outside, Willow Run looked like a monument to steel and glass. But inside, it was something far more powerful. A symbol that democracy could outbuild, outlast, and outfight dictatorship. Every bomber that roared off its runways wasn't just metal. It was belief. Belief that ordinary people, when united by purpose, could bring a tyrant's empire crashing down. And across the ocean, as those bombers darkened German skies, Willow Run's heartbeat echoed louder than any speech, any slogan, any battlefield. It was democracy with wings. Behind the roar of assembly lines and the pride of Rosie the Riveter lay a quieter truth. Willow Run demanded sacrifices just as heavy as those born on battlefields. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers pulled exhausting shifts that blurred into one another, 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours of unbroken labour. The heat from welding torches and engines turned the factory into a furnace, and the deafening clatter of machinery left ears ringing long after workers stepped outside. Many collapsed from exhaustion on the line, only to be replaced instantly by another set of hands. There was no pause, no luxury of rest. Families strained under the weight. Wives left children with neighbours or older siblings while they worked overnight. Young mothers nursed their babies in stolen breaks, then returned to the line with trembling arms. Husbands, too old for the draft, joined them, their hands blistered from tools they had never used before. Children grew up in crowded trailer camps built near the factory, learning to fall asleep to the hum of engines instead of lullabies. Accidents were inevitable. Fingers crushed in presses, burns from molten metal, even deaths when safety was sacrificed for speed. Each tragedy was hushed, buried under the relentless demand for quotas. 1 bomber an hour, the managers said, and nothing, not even human frailty, could get in the way. And yet, despite the pain, the workers endured. They knew the war's cost wasn't measured only in sweat and hours, it was measured in lives overseas. Every delay, every flaw, every mistake could mean American soldiers stranded without air cover, convoys sunk by U-boats, or cities left unprotected. That knowledge weighed heavier than fatigue. It kept them moving when their bodies wanted to collapse. One woman, years later, recalled the guilt of missing her son's first steps because she was riveting a wing. "I told myself," she said, "better I miss it than he never come home at all." Willow Run was not just an arsenal. It was a crucible. A place where ordinary Americans burned away their comfort, their health, even their family time, to forge weapons they would never see used, yet weapons that would change the course of history. And though they never carried rifles, many paid a soldier's price all the same. By 1945, the war that once seemed destined for German triumph had turned into a slow-motion collapse. The Reich's cities lay in ruins, its skies ruled by endless fleets of bombers, its people weary from nights in shelters and days in rubble. The whispers that German intelligence had first heard back in 1943 were no longer whispers. They were reality, roaring overhead in formations so vast they became the soundtrack of defeat. And at the center of it all, thousands of miles away, stood a factory in Michigan, Willow Run, a place built not on bloodlines or ideology, but on bolts, sweat, and the stubborn belief that democracy could be mass-produced. Its workers never set foot in Berlin or Hamburg, never stormed beaches or marched through liberated cities. But their fingerprints were on every rivet of the plains that darkened Europe's skies. Their sacrifices, missed childhoods, broken bodies, exhausted nights, became invisible threads woven into the fabric of victory. For Germany, the lesson was brutal. Strength of will, pride of race, the cult of the individual, none of it could compete with the cold arithmetic of industry. The Reich had built a war machine, but America had built something larger, a machine that built machines, and in that difference lay the outcome of the war. Yet victory came with shadows. The same industrial logic that defeated fascism also revealed a haunting truth. Humanity had learned to wage war not as warriors, but as engineers. Death itself could be assembled on a line, faster than empires could resist. Willow Run was both miracle and omen, proof that freedom could outlast tyranny, but also a glimpse of a future where machines, not men, determined the fate of nations. When the last B-24 rolled off the line in 1945, the workers cheered. The war was ending, soldiers would come home, the arsenal of democracy had done its job, but as the factory gates closed, many wondered what their sacrifice had truly meant. Was it victory? Was it survival? Or was it the birth of something far more terrifying, an age where wars would be fought not just on battlefields, but in factories, in supply chains, in the cold precision of mathematics? Willow Run stood silent after the war, but its echo never died. Because in every city rebuilt, in every nation reshaped, in every lesson of power since, its shadow still lingers. The factory that built victory. The factory that built the future.